For 3 days in July 1863, quiet Pennsylvania town became the center of the American Civil War. When the fighting ended, more than 50,000 soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing, and the direction of the war had changed. Gettysburg was not just a battle. It was the moment the Confederacy's advance stopped. In the summer of 1863, the American Civil War had already entered its third year. The Confederacy, led by General Robert E. Lee, had achieved several major victories in Virginia. Morale in the South was strong. Lee believed the time had come to carry the war into Union territory. His objectives were strategic and political. First, moving north would relieve pressure on war-torn Virginia farmland. Second, a decisive victory on Union soil might weaken Northern morale. And third, it could influence foreign governments watching closely from Europe. If the Confederacy could win a major battle in the North, the balance of the war might shift. Lee's army of Northern Virginia began marching north through Maryland and into Pennsylvania. His army was experienced, confident, and aggressive. Many of his officers had fought together for years. They trusted one another. The Union Army, now under new leadership, moved to intercept. Just days before Gettysburg, Major General George G. Meade took command of the Army of the Potomac. He inherited an army that had suffered defeat and leadership changes, but it was large and capable. Both armies were moving through unfamiliar terrain. Neither side initially intended to fight at Gettysburg specifically. The town held no obvious strategic importance. It was a crossroads, nothing more. But in war, crossroads matter. On July 1st, Confederate troops approached Gettysburg from the west. They encountered Union cavalry already positioned nearby. The clash began almost unexpectedly. Small skirmishes that quickly escalated. Union cavalry under General John Buford recognized the importance of the high ground south of town. Instead of retreating immediately, they delayed Confederate advance long enough for Union infantry to arrive. That decision would shape the entire battle. As Union forces reached the field, they moved to secure Cemetery Hill and the ridges beyond it. These elevations offered defensive advantage. Whoever controlled the high ground could anchor their line. Meanwhile, Confederate forces pushed forward through Gettysburg. Fighting spread across fields, roads, and town streets. By afternoon, Union troops north and west of town were forced to fall back. They retreated through the streets of Gettysburg, toward the high ground south of town. The first day ended with Confederate forces occupying the town itself. While Union forces held stronger defensive positions along Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and Culp's Hill, the shape of the battlefield began to form. Union lines curved along the high ground in a fishhook pattern. Confederate forces faced them from lower terrain. Lee had achieved success on the first day, but he had not destroyed the Union Army. That distinction mattered. On the evening of July 1st, Lee considered his options. Some of his commanders advised caution, regroup, assess, perhaps maneuver around the Union position. Lee chose differently. He believed the Union Army was vulnerable, and that swift pressure could break their line before they fully consolidated. On July 2nd, the fighting would intensify. Both armies strengthened positions overnight. Reinforcements arrived. Artillery was placed carefully along ridges. Infantry dug shallow defensive works where possible. The town of Gettysburg, once quiet farmland, was now surrounded by tens of thousands of soldiers preparing for a larger confrontation. Union forces held the high ground, an advantage that would shape every assault. Confederate forces, confident after earlier victories, prepared to attack. Neither side yet understood that Gettysburg would become the bloodiest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. But the lines were drawn. The first day had determined the terrain. The next 2 days would determine the outcome. And by the time it was over, the war itself would begin to change direction. When July 2nd began, both armies understood that the previous day had only set the stage. The Union Army now held a defensive line shaped roughly like a fishhook. It stretched from Culp's Hill on the right, down across Cemetery Hill, and along Cemetery Ridge, before curving toward the rocky hills known as Little Round Top and Big Round Top on the left. It was strong ground. General Meade intended to defend it. General Lee intended to break it. Lee's plan for the second day was coordinated pressure. He would attack the Union left flank while also applying force elsewhere along the line. If one section collapsed, the entire Union position could unravel. But coordination in war is rarely perfect. Delays in communication and movement disrupted Lee's timing. Confederate forces did not strike as early as planned. This allowed Union reinforcements to arrive and strengthen vulnerable positions. By late afternoon, the fighting began in earnest on the Union left. Confederate troops under General James Longstreet advanced toward the rocky hills south of Cemetery Ridge. The terrain there was uneven, covered with boulders, fields, fences, and patches of forest. Units became separated. Lines became irregular. One of the most critical positions was Little Round Top. It was not heavily defended at first. If Confederate forces seized it, they could fire down the length of the Union line. The entire defensive structure would be exposed. Union officers recognized the danger just in time. Brigadier General Governor Warren ordered troops to rush toward Little Round Top. Among them was the 20th Maine Regiment, commanded by Colonel Joshua Chamberlain. As Confederate soldiers climbed the rocky slope, Union defenders positioned themselves along the crest. Fighting was intense and close. Ammunition began to run low. At one critical moment, Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge down the hill. It was a desperate decision, but it worked. Confederate troops fell back. Little Round Top held. Elsewhere along the Union left, fighting raged in places later known as the Wheatfield, the Peach Orchard, and Devil's Den. These were not grand strategic locations. They were farms and rocky outcrops. But for hours, they became focal points of violence. Lines shifted back and forth. Units advanced and retreated repeatedly. Artillery thundered across open fields. Smoke filled the air, obscuring visibility and amplifying confusion. Confederate forces achieved partial breakthroughs in some areas. The Peach Orchard fell. The Wheatfield changed hands multiple times. Yet the Union line bent. It did not break. On the Union right, Culp's Hill also saw heavy fighting as Confederate forces attempted to apply pressure there. Union troops defended earthworks and elevated positions, making progress difficult. By nightfall, the second day ended, much as the first had. Confederate forces had inflicted heavy casualties and seized some ground. But they had not shattered the Union defense. Casualties mounted rapidly on both sides. Men who had marched north with confidence now confronted the reality of sustained battle. Commanders assessed positions under fading light. Ammunition was replenished where possible. Units reorganized. Lee faced a decision. He had attacked both flanks and failed to break the line. Some of his generals advised maneuvering around the Union Army instead of continuing frontal assaults. Lee believed the Union center had been weakened during the day's fighting. He chose to attack again. July 3rd would bring the most famous moment of the battle, a direct assault against the Union center along Cemetery Ridge. It would become known as Pickett's Charge. But at the end of July 2nd, that decision was still only an intention. The Union line remained intact. The high ground still belonged to Meade, and as soldiers rested briefly under the summer sky, neither army fully grasped how costly the final day would become. Gettysburg was no longer an accidental encounter. It was a deliberate test of endurance, and both sides were committed to seeing it through. By the morning of July 3rd, 1863, the battlefield had already absorbed 2 days of relentless fighting. Tens of thousands of soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. Yet neither army had withdrawn. Both remained locked in place, facing one another across open ground. General Robert E. Lee believed the Union line had been weakened at its center. After attacking both flanks on July 2nd without decisive success, he chose a direct assault against the middle of Cemetery Ridge. It was a bold decision. Some of Lee's senior officers expressed concern. The Union Army held elevated ground. The open field between the two lines stretched nearly a mile. Any attacking force would be fully exposed to artillery and rifle fire. But Lee believed momentum still favored him. If the Union center broke, the entire defensive line could collapse. Around midday, Confederate artillery opened fire in what became one of the largest bombardments of the Civil War. Cannon thundered across the field for nearly 2 hours. Smoke rolled over Cemetery Ridge. The intention was to weaken Union artillery and disrupt infantry positions before the main assault. Union forces responded, but eventually reduced their own cannon fire. Confederate commanders interpreted this as a sign that Union guns had been disabled. It was a costly miscalculation. When the artillery barrage ended, Approximately 12,000 Confederate soldiers stepped forward in formation. Among them were divisions led by General George Pickett, whose name would later define the charge. They advanced across open farmland toward the Union Center. The scene was stark. Long lines of gray uniforms moved steadily forward under a summer sky. Drums beat. Officers maintained order. Flags waved above ranks. At first, the march appeared controlled. Then Union artillery reopened fire. Cannonballs tore through the advancing lines. Shells exploded among tightly packed soldiers. Gaps opened, then closed, as men continued forward. The discipline was visible, but so were the losses. As Confederate troops crossed fences and uneven ground, their formation began to fragment, yet they continued pressing toward Cemetery Ridge. When they reached rifle range, Union infantry rose from behind stone walls and defensive positions. Musket volleys erupted in coordinated waves. The open field offered no protection. Men fell in large numbers. Units on the flanks struggled to maintain alignment. Commanders attempted to adjust, but the forward momentum became increasingly difficult to sustain. Despite overwhelming fire, a portion of the Confederate force reached the Union line at a shallow angle along Cemetery Ridge. For a brief moment, close combat erupted at what is now known as the Angle. This was the high-water mark of the Confederacy. The phrase captures more than geography. It represents the furthest point north, and the closest Confederate forces came to breaking Union defense during the entire war. But they could not hold it. Union reinforcements rushed into the breach. Artillery fired canister at close range. Confederate soldiers, exhausted and heavily reduced in number, could not maintain their position. The charge faltered. Survivors began retreating across the same open ground they had crossed minutes earlier. The return was chaotic and devastating. Many who had advanced did not return. Pickett's charge had failed. The cost was staggering. Thousands of Confederate soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in less than an hour. Entire regiments were effectively destroyed. Officers who had led from the front were among the casualties. Lee rode out to meet the survivors, reportedly telling them, "It is all my fault." It was a rare admission. The assault had not been caused by lack of courage. It had failed because of terrain, preparation, and defensive strength. By the afternoon of July 3rd, the momentum of the battle had shifted permanently. The following day, Lee began withdrawing his army south toward Virginia. Heavy rain fell during the retreat. The Union Army, though victorious, did not aggressively pursue an immediate force. Gettysburg was over. The total casualties from the three-day battle exceeded 50,000, making it the bloodiest engagement of the Civil War. But its importance was not measured by numbers alone. Gettysburg ended the Confederacy's major invasion of the North. It halted Lee's strategic initiative. From that point forward, Confederate forces would primarily fight defensively. The same week Gettysburg concluded, Union forces captured Vicksburg in the west, gaining control of the Mississippi River. Together, these events marked a turning point. The Confederacy would continue fighting for nearly 2 more years, but the possibility of foreign recognition diminished. The hope of a decisive Northern victory faded. Months later, President Abraham Lincoln returned to Gettysburg to dedicate a national cemetery. His brief address reframed the battle not only as a military event, but as a test of the nation's principles. Gettysburg became more than a battlefield. It became a symbol of sacrifice, a symbol of endurance, a symbol of a war beginning to turn toward its conclusion. On that Pennsylvania ground, the direction of the Civil War changed. Not through surprise, not through maneuver, but through endurance and a charge that could not succeed. It was war before it became memory.